Hello, biologists. Today we're going to talk about ecosystem dynamics. Now, an ecosystem, such as what's being shown in this picture, which is the Sandy River, is a community of living organisms. So all the individual species that are living there interacting together and their interactions with the abiotic environment. When we think about ecosystems, we often think about food chains to try to describe how these organisms are working together. Now, a food chain is a linear system like we're seeing in this diagram. Each level in the chain is called a trophic level. At the bottom, we have our primary producers. Those are going to be photosynthetic organisms, not always, but usually they're going to be photosynthetic organisms. So in this case, we have an aquatic system. We're starting with some green algae. Then whoever eats the primary producer, the thing that's doing photosynthesis, that's going to be the primary consumer. In this case, we have a few little mollusks. They are the primary consumer because they are the first to eat the plant. So it's the first eater. Then we have whoever eats the first eater, that's going to be the secondary consumer. Then we would have the tertiary consumer and so on, and it can continue in levels until you get to the apex consumer. The apex consumer is the highest on the level of the food web or the food chain like this. We say food webs when we have more complicated relationships because most organisms don't only have one food source. Some do, and food chains are really nice to track energy and calories, but they're not representative of most creatures on Earth. So most creatures like this elk here, it's going to have variable food sources. So there are four different primary producers. Your elk would be your primary consumer, and then whoever eats the elk, such as this wolf, would be your tertiary consumer. But if we look at this grass, whoever eats the grass, like the mouse, that's the primary consumer. Now I have a secondary consumer, and the wolf is the tertiary consumer. So it depends what the wolf is eating, whether or not it is the tertiary or secondary consumer. We also use these to describe the interactions between organisms. So when it's called a trophic cascade, we're showing the positive interactions and the negative interactions, whether or not they are increasing or decreasing the number of organisms in an ecosystem. So a coyote might decrease the number of mice, but the number of mice might decrease the number of grasses, and the number of grasses you have can be related to the amount of wildfires that you have. And so it's this nice interlocking system, hence the word cascade. Now, imagine that you ate an apple as a snack. What's your trophic level? You would be the primary consumer. The apple's the primary producer. Now imagine that you ate a hamburger patty alone, so no buns, no toppings, and that hamburger patty is made of all grass-fed beef. What's your trophic level? You are now a secondary consumer because you are eating the primary consumer that ate the primary producer. I want you to think, have you ever seen a bear or a bobcat? And if you have, how many times have you seen them? What about a coyote or a deer or a squirrel? And this might feel like a duh question, like, of course I've seen a squirrel. I see squirrels every day in my backyard. But I want to think about why are these organisms so much more common than the other organisms? We have herbivores and omnivores, and we have carnivores, but their quantity in the ecosystem is different. And the reason their quantity in the ecosystem is different is based on this idea called the pyramid of productivity. We also call it the 10% rule. And it's this idea that of the sunlight that comes to Earth, only about 10% of it gets put into plants. And then of that energy that's in plants, only about 10% of it is available for primary consumers. And then whoever eats primary consumers, only 10% of it is available for secondary consumers. And so in this diagram here, where we start with 1,000,000 joules, a measure of energy, we quickly go down to 10 for our tertiary consumers. So there is just a lot less energy available for the organisms higher in the food chain. So that's why these organisms are apex organisms are less common because there's less energy available to them. One of the things that biologists love to say when we talk about energy cycles is that energy flows, so energy is flowing through this pyramid, and nutrients cycle. So here, our diagram, we can see our energy flowing in from the sun and energy flowing out at every level as heat lost. So we have a lot of loss of energy through this. We have a word called entropy that describes this. However, nutrients can't leave Earth. They are stuck on Earth. So all of our carbon, all of our nitrogen, all of our phosphorus, those nutrients, those elements, they just cycle through the system. So they will be in a primary producer. The producer will die, it'll decompose, it'll be used again. It might be eaten by an organism. Those will die and decompose and be used again. And so the nutrients stay fixed, but the energy flows throughout. If the energy stayed fixed, we would have an equal amount of energy available for each trophic level. We can measure our energy. We're going to start with gross primary production. Gross primary production is the amount of energy from sunlight converted into organic molecules by photosynthetic organisms. So this is how much plants can make organic molecules via photosynthesis. Now, plants need to use what they make, but they don't use all of it. Some they store in their bodies. So the net primary production is what is available for the primary consumers to eat. Those primary consumers are not going to get all the energy that's made because the plant has used some up to continue to survive. So net primary production is gross primary production minus respiration, which is the amount the plants need to use to stay alive. And it's about half of GPP. Our net primary production, the amount of energy that's available for organisms in plants, is not equally distributed across the globe. So up at the poles, there's none. So it's none. That's what white is. It's just absolutely not on the record at all because there's no plants there. When there are plants, we have a scale of 0 to 1200, and we can see all the red is up at the top at the higher levels, and then around the equator, that's where we find all of the purple and blue. So our highest level of net primary production is around the equators. And that makes sense when we think about plants, right? Because the equator is 12 hours of sunlight every day, all year long. It's basically 70 degrees all year long. There are two seasons, wet and extra wet, but there is no winter. And so that's like the perfect habitat for plants to grow. And so plants are just booming there, and that's where we find the most NPP. We can look at it based on biome. So here we have a couple things happening. We have our different biomes along the side. We have NPP per unit area covered by the ecosystem type, and the total NPP. Down at the bottom, we have the scale bar for each graph, but we also have the average net PP times the percent of the Earth's surface equals the total. So that's how we got this graph here, is by multiplying these two together. And this makes sense, right? Because if I have an area that's really productive, but it's like 1% of Earth, it's not going to contribute as much to the total percent of Earth as somewhere that has a large amount of space. Let's check it out. Tropical wet forest, a lot of NPP per unit area, one of the highest. Coral reefs and algal beds are a bit higher. But by area, coral reefs and algal beds, a lot lower space covering on Earth. Here is our tropical wet forest. And that, when we times them together, gives us a much higher NPP for tropical wet forest than it does for coral reefs, even though in a coral reef they are producing more NPP. They just don't cover enough surface area. Let's look at this bar here. So this is in blue, this is aquatic. This is our open oceans. There's not a lot of NPP happening in the open oceans, but there's a whole lot of open ocean. So even if there's a little bit happening and there's just a lot of open ocean, that leads to a huge amount of NPP total. In fact, check out this scale bar. Everyone else ends around 5-ish, and then we go to 6. To get the open ocean in the scale bar, they had to slash it and go up to 65. So if this was to scale, this would continue for like a huge long way and then end at 65, but that would look ridiculous. And so we slashed it. We had to break our scale bar. And that helps explain why the NPP of the open ocean is so total high, even though it's volume low. We also can measure another idea called net ecosystem exchange. So net ecosystem exchange is the amount of carbon created via photosynthesis minus how much is lost by respiration from producers and consumers. So now we're not just thinking about the plants, we're thinking about the organisms that eat the plants. Here we have photosynthesis occurring. So this is sunlight being converted to organic molecules. That's gross primary production. So that's what's happening in the plants. Then we have the plants doing respiration to stay alive. We have all of their little roots doing respiration to stay alive. If you make your own sugars via photosynthesis, you are an autotroph. So this is autotroph respiration. Our heterotrophs are going to be eating the plants, and we've included fungi, our detritivores, which are going to be eating the dead plants or the sick plants, or maybe they're parasites. But either way, our heterotrophs who cannot make their own food, they're going to be doing cellular respiration as well. So they're going to be releasing carbon back into the atmosphere. Thus, our net ecosystem exchange is the total amount of organic molecules you make via photosynthesis minus how much respiration is going on from your autotrophs and your heterotrophs. So that's like what's left over that could support more life. Now, when we're thinking about these pyramids and flows of nutrients and energy, we also have to think about another concept called biomagnification. So we know magnification is taking something and making it bigger, and adding the prefix bio implies that it's happening inside of living things. I've got two examples for you. One is the concentration of DDT. DDT was a chemical. We tried to use it to get rid of mosquitoes. We sprayed it over everything. If you go on YouTube, you can find videos of like these spraying trucks going down the street and kids dancing in the spray. Turns out it's a nasty chemical and we don't use it anymore. But it's now in our water. And the problem with it being in water is not huge because it's a low concentration, right? It's just one. That's our concentration. But DDT sticks in lipids. And so if I have lipids in this water, it will aggregate in the lipids. And as the water is used by phytoplankton, a primary producer, it gets stuck in their lipids. And so now where the concentration was low in the water, it's higher in the phytoplankton. The things that eat the phytoplankton, such as zooplankton, it's going to be even higher in them because they're eating a concentration that's higher than the water. When small fish eat the zooplankton, it's going to magnify in them even further, and larger fish even further, until we get up to these fish-eating birds, these tertiary or apex consumers. They're going to have the highest level of DDT, and it has caused health issues in these predatory birds because this is a huge amount of DDT. And so it's just increasing in concentration of the food chain. The same thing with mercury. Mercury is a metal. Mercury causes health problems. Mercury is released into the water source from coal and volcano and mines. And then methylmercury gets into the water. It's not particularly high in concentration, but the krill get it. And then whoever eats the krill get it. And then whoever eats the thing that eats the krill gets it. And each time you move up the step, you have a higher level of mercury in these organisms. And so your apex predator has the highest level in their body. Note here, this is EPA advice for consumption. You can eat salmon and oyster unlimited because the concentration of mercury is pretty low in them. But trout, tuna, specifically canned tuna, it says eat a few times a week at maximum. And things like albacore, pike, halibut, shark, only eat a few times a month. If you've ever heard that you shouldn't eat tuna while pregnant, this is because of that mercury level. Keystone species are key for our ecosystem dynamics. A keystone species is an organism that has a higher impact on everybody else in its ecosystem than you would think based on its biomass. So we have keystone predators, we have keystone prey, we have keystone species that help make the environment itself, the physical habitat, more livable for others. But the keystone species is holding the ecosystem together. For example, we have this orange sea star. We started counting the number of species present with and without the orange sea star in 1963 through a 10-year period. And what we found was when the apex predator was present, the number of species stayed relatively constant, right? Maybe a little bit of an increase, but just relatively stable. When the orange sea star was removed, the number of species in the ecosystem dropped off. Without that predator, nobody else was really able to maintain the ecosystem, and the ecosystem kind of declined. I've got two videos. I think I might have added a third for you because this is such a fascinating concept. Keystone species really have an outsized impact. They're super cool. And that brings us to an idea of how our ecosystem changes over time. So if a keystone species is holding the ecosystem together, what happens when ecosystems change? We have a word for an ecosystem that's stable. We call it equilibrium. In equilibrium, all of the organisms are in balance, everybody is supporting each other, your ecosystem is functional, it can maintain that habitat for a long period of time. Now, resistance is your ability to withhold equilibrium in spite of disturbances. And resilience is if there is a disturbance, how quickly you can bounce back to equilibrium. Now, what's a disturbance? A disturbance is anything that's going to disrupt the species distribution and range and overall abiotic factors of an ecosystem. For example, a flood, a fire, an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, humans moving into the area and building suburbs, whatever it is, those are ecosystem disturbances. And how an ecosystem responds to a disturbance is fascinating. We call this process succession. There's two types of succession. One is primary, and that is when the disturbance is so bad, everything is wiped out. So, like, not only the plants and animals are gone, but the soil and all of the microbes, like, everything is gone. This happens less often, and it's really severe. So, examples are a volcanic eruption. So, it will just destroy everything around it. That new lava that flows out, that's completely bare rock. That's the image I have here. This is lava rock that's being slowly worked back to an equilibrium, an apex community. And in that situation, to regain that habitat, we follow a certain set of steps. Now, the other type of succession is secondary succession. Secondary succession is when there is a severe disturbance, a flood, a fire, something pretty intense, but the soil stays intact. So maybe all the plants are gone, all the animals are gone, all the grass is gone, but there's microbes. And so those microbes are really beneficial. Soil is so important. And the way that an ecosystem bounces back after a secondary succession event is different. Let's look at the primary one first. So here is our event. Let's say that it is Mount St. Helens erupted and there's this massive lava flow and it just wiped out a whole area. And now we have bare rock. So this is primary succession occurring on that bare rock. The first thing that's going to happen is pioneer species are going to move in. Pioneer species are lichen, mosses, little tiny fungi. They're things that can live on bare rock, not really much else can. So those are our pioneer species. Those pioneer species will move in, they'll start eating the bare rock, they'll break the bare rock down, they'll start to create soil. And now that you've created soil, we can move into the intermediary stage. In the intermediate stage, that little bit of soil means that you can get some tiny plants, you can get grasses. Those grasses will make more soil. That's going to lead to more plants. Now you get shrubs. Once you get shrubs and grasses, you can have bugs, you can have birds, you can have rodents. So life starts moving in after the soil is reestablished. As life fully moves back into the area, and our ecosystem returns to what it used to be or a stable version of whatever it is now, we call that a climax stage. So this would be a ecosystem in equilibrium. Climax means like it's fully mature. It is a stable, mature forest. It is biodiverse, it is happy, it is stable. Now, secondary succession, let's say a fire wiped out all the plants, but it didn't kill the soil. Because the soil is still there, we can have pioneer species again, but it doesn't have to be moss and lichen. Now it can be things like grasses and annuals and perennials, soft, tiny little plants that have thin root mats. They're going to use the nutrients in that soil that is still there. And as they grow, they're going to replenish the soil. Their bodies are going to die. They're going to get decomposed. They're going to return nutrients. Those nutrients are going to allow bigger plants to move in. You're going to get shrubs, small trees. That means birds and bugs and rodents, and everybody can move back to the habitat until you have your climax community. So what is the process? Pioneer, intermediate, climax. Now that you have a climax community, it can be in a state of equilibrium. We also are going to measure our communities based on their structure. So not just how far along they are in maturity, but what kind of species are there and how they're distributed. Your number of species is determined by species richness. So more species, higher richness. And your abundance of species is determined by species evenness. In total, we use those two ideas to talk about biodiversity. And we talk about biodiversity as an index. We want to be a high index for lots of biodiversity. I've got two communities here. This is community A, and this is community B. Both of these communities have 4 types of mushrooms. So they have equal species richness. However, community A has a higher distribution of one type of mushroom than the others. So this is a low species evenness. Community B has a relatively equal distribution of all 4 mushrooms. This is a higher species evenness. So even though the number of species is the same, how these communities interact and what's going on is different. I've got several practice questions for you now. That's what we're going to do for the remaining of the lecture. We're going to start with toxoplasmosis. I hope you've heard about toxoplasmosis before. It's the crazy cat lady disease. So toxoplasmosis is a parasite. It's an apicomplexan, and it infects cats. And when cats get it, they have little tiny oocytes in their feces. And that's how it spreads to humans. So humans can get it from scooping cat litter boxes or being in areas where cats are defecating, like a cat in a barn or a cat living in your shed, whatever. If you're exposed to the feces, you might get the parasite through these little tiny cysts. The cat can also spread it through the feces to other animals that it's exposed to. Note that these are all farm animals, things that you might find in a barn with a cat. And then once these animals are infected, by eating their flesh, because the oocyte will hang out in the cyst of these animals and not the feces, by eating the flesh, it can get transmitted to humans or it can get transmitted back to cats. What's really fascinating about this disease, we estimate that half the population on Earth has this. The side effects are very nil, so we don't really know if we have it or not. And it might change the behavior of people who have it. So when a rodent gets infected, we think that the rodent becomes less scared of cats. So now this rodent that has the parasite might walk over to this cat. And what's the cat going to do? It's going to kill it and eat it. And that ensures that the parasite is transmitted to the cat. We also think that maybe when cats have it and they give it to humans via their poop, it changes how humans interact with cats. And it makes us more in love with cats and want more cats. And that's why it's called the crazy cat lady disease, is because you want to just have all the cats. There's a lot of really interesting research about this. This diagram here is from the CDC. But what's the question? The question is, infection with this apicomplexan is shown to alter the behavior of mice and rats in ways thought to increase the rodent's chance of being preyed upon by cats, which in turn infects the cat with the parasite. Which organism benefits most from this symbiosis? It is the apicomplexan. Domestic cats often fight over territory. What kind of competition is this? It's within one species, So it's intra-specific competition. Now imagine each of these boxes contains a community, and each shape is a different species. Which community has both low species richness and low species evenness? E. Low species richness means the least number of species, so there's only two. This one also only has two, but species evenness is the relative abundance. In this one, blue is overrepresented. Here, blue and green are equal. And so this is the lowest evenness and richness. Coral snakes and king snakes look similar, but coral snakes are venomous. What kind of mimicry is this? It's Batesian. I don't know if you were like a young person in the 90s, but we had a phrase that we used to use. We would call people biters, and that meant that they were copying you. So I always think Batesian biters because they're copying the venomous organism. In Mullerian, both of the organisms are dangerous or distasteful, and they look similar. Like wasps and bees, they look similar. That's Mullerian. But a hoverfly that's mimicking a wasp but is harmless, it's a biter. So it's Batesian, if that helps. This diagram is showing primary succession or secondary succession. It's primary because we're starting with bare rock. All right, that is the end of our lecture for today. I hope that was interesting, and email me anytime with questions. We'll talk soon.